People always say America is such a big country. But for me, my whole world fit inside one small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A white house with a low wooden fence, a few rose bushes out front, and a swing hanging from a big maple tree. That little house was everything my husband and I built over 25 years. I remember the very first day we moved in. It was a chilly fall afternoon, red leaves swirling all over the yard. We didn't have much, just a couple of cardboard boxes, an old mattress, and this unshakable belief that as long as we had each other, we'd be okay. Back then, my husband, the man I always called my life partner, was just starting out trying to build his career from scratch. I worked part-time at the community library, and in the evenings I'd bake or mend clothes. We weren't wealthy, but life felt whole. Money wasn't something I ever thought about. Then we had a son. He grew up in that house, walking to the little elementary school down the street, setting up tents in the front yard, during the summer building snowmen every winter. When he went off to college and later started a family of his own, he came home less often. But I understood. That's how life works here. Kids grow up, leave the nest, and build their own lives. I never held that against him. All those years, I never once cared about bank accounts or investments. I trusted my husband. To me, family meant more than any number on a piece of paper. My husband came from a well-off family. Me, not so much. And yes, there were times when some of his relatives would give me a look, that kind of quiet judgment, like I didn't really belong. But I stayed quiet. I never argued, never tried to prove myself. I believed that time and the way I chose to live would speak for me. I've always been a quiet person. People sometimes mistake that for weakness. But it wasn't that. I just never wanted to bring more storms into our home. Whatever came my way, I learned to swallow it just to keep the peace. My husband knew that. He was my middle ground, my shield. Not just my husband, but my best friend. He was the one safe place I had in this big, wide country. I never thought about what it would feel like to stand without him. As the years went by, his health began to fade. At first, just a little fatigue. Then it was doctor's appointments, test results, endless medications. The house that used to be full of laughter became a place of medical machines and the smell of disinfectant. I tried to keep the outside world from seeing him at his weakest. I took care of everything: meals, hospital runs, holding his trembling hands at night. In those final months, our son came home to visit, but he was busy, caught up in the rush of his own life. And honestly, I understood. That's life here, work pulls you in. His wife was polite, but always a little distant. I didn't hold it against them. I just wanted my husband to have time with his family while he still could. One evening, he held my hand and said, "Honey, I'm so grateful for you. My only regret is that we'll never get to take all those trips we dreamed about." I smiled even though my eyes were wet. "Then get better. We'll take them when you do. For now, just rest." But deep down, we both knew that trip would never happen. The day he passed, the whole neighborhood was wrapped in fog. I sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand until it grew cold. There were no screams, no wailing, just this heavy, deafening silence. I didn't even have tears left to cry. After the funeral, the house felt unbearably empty. I would walk into the living room and swear I could still hear him laughing. The smell of morning coffee, the squeak of his favorite chair, it was all still there. All that was missing was him. I told myself, at least I still have this house. These walls hold everything we ever built together. At that time, I believed in one thing: family. I believed that my son and daughter-in-law would help me keep what his father left behind. Not because of money, but because this house held every memory we shared. I had no idea that this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into clearing closets, organizing paperwork, trying to keep busy. My son and his wife came by more often, which I appreciated. But I started noticing something in their eyes, not just grief. Something else. Something that felt calculating. I brushed it off. I told myself I was imagining things because I was tired and lonely. Every now and then, I would overhear their phone conversations. I'd catch words like assets and how we should divide things. The moment I knocked on the door, they'd hang up and put on a polite smile. I pretended not to hear. I reminded myself, in this country, it's normal for parents to leave things to their children. It's part of the culture. I didn't want to believe my own son would ever put things before family. So I stayed silent. I kept tending the garden, sweeping leaves, cleaning shelves one by one. When grief gets that heavy, there's no strength left to argue. You just hold it in and keep moving. At night, the house was so quiet I could hear the wind through the cracks of the door. I would sit in my old armchair with a lamp on, flipping through our photo albums, our wedding in a small-town church, our boy on his first day of school, the summer picnics at national parks. Those pictures were so beautiful they felt eternal. But reality was different. In just a short time, everything had changed forever. I had lost my husband, and somewhere deep down I could feel another storm coming, one I wasn't ready for. I would walk around the house, run my hands along the walls, and whisper, "No matter what happens, I'll hold on to this place. Even if the whole world turns its back, this will always be our home." What I didn't know was that this promise would become the quietest battle of my life. I thought that after he was gone, at the very least, we would hold on to what he left behind. But I've learned that when money gets involved, people can change faster than I ever imagined. They say that once the funeral ends and the house goes quiet, that's when the real grief begins. But for me, it wasn't just grief. It came with something I never thought I'd have to face in my lifetime, a coldness that came from my own flesh and blood. A week after my husband passed, the house that had been full of people, neighbors, dropping by, friends bringing food, suddenly felt hollow. Everyone went back to their own lives. It was just me, my son, and my daughter-in-law. I thought this loss would bring us closer. I was wrong. I started to notice the way my son's eyes changed whenever he passed the living room, where his father's photo sat on the mantel. The sadness was fading, replaced by something else. Calculation. My daughter-in-law spent more time on the phone, whispering in the corner. Every time she caught me looking, she'd lock the screen and smile like nothing happened. I told myself I was being too sensitive. And then the phone call came. The lawyer asked me to come to his office to hear the reading of the will. I'd never thought much about that sort of thing. Here in America, everything is on paper anyway. I assumed it would be simple, a house, a little savings. I didn't expect anything more. The office was in an old red brick building downtown, the kind you'd see in a small Midwestern town movie. I arrived early. When I walked in, my son and his wife were already there, heads bent over their phones. They didn't look up. I sat quietly, my hands folded together, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. The lawyer opened a thick folder and began to read in a steady, even tone. According to the will, the majority of the estate, including investments and savings estimated at roughly $8 million, will be transferred to the primary heir, the son with financial oversight for a period of 5 years. The surviving spouse will receive a modest monthly allowance and access to a few minor assets. Every word cut into me like a blade. I am not a greedy woman. But in that moment, all the years of standing by his side through good times and hard ones suddenly felt reduced to the word allowance. I looked at my son. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stared straight ahead as if this was all expected. And my daughter-in-law. She smiled just a little. The lawyer kept reading, but after that I couldn't hear a thing. My mind went blank. So many years of sacrifice, and in the end I was written into a few lines on a piece of paper. When the reading was over, the lawyer politely asked if I had any questions. I shook my head. I couldn't speak. On the way back to the car, my son walked fast, never looking back. His wife followed slowly behind. Just before getting in the car, she stopped, placed her hand on the window and said softly, but clearly, "Mom, I think it's best if we sell this house. It's too big and too lonely for you now. You could rent a smaller place. It'll be easier." I stood there frozen. I had never felt so alone. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Every memory, every meal, every brick we laid, every stroke of paint we brushed on these walls was dismissed with one sentence. That night I came home to the empty house. I sat in the living room and looked at my husband's photo. His eyes in that frame were as gentle as ever. I whispered, "Do you know the house we spent a lifetime building? They want to sell it as if it's just another thing to trade away." A few days later, my son came back with a folder in his hands. He didn't ask this time. He just said, "Mom, these are the papers to list the house. I've already contacted a realtor. You just need to sign them sooner rather than later." I looked at him. For the first time in my life, I didn't recognize my own child. My voice shook. "Son, I don't want to sell. This house is mine and your father's. If I need money, I'll figure it out. But please don't sell this house." He sighed and put the pen down. "Mom, Dad trusted me with everything. Holding on to this place doesn't make sense. My wife and I already have our plans." I wanted to scream, to cry, to tear those papers apart. But I didn't. I just stood up and walked to my room. The door closed behind me, and their voices turned to whispers again. That night, I didn't sleep. The ticking of the clock felt like it was pressing on my chest. One question kept echoing in my head. Why I thought about the nights I stayed awake nursing him through fevers, all the pennies I saved for his college tuition, the moment I hugged him at his graduation. I had always believed that no matter how harsh life in America could be, family was the one thing that would never betray you. But I was wrong. In the days that followed, the house filled with strangers, real estate agents, buyers walking through talking about square footage and resale value. I stood quietly in the corner listening as they discussed numbers, not knowing that every wall they touched held my life. I didn't cry. I just felt this weight like a stone on my chest. People here like to say, "Move on." But how do you move on when the last piece of your life, the last bit of love you have left, is being sold right in front of you? I knew I couldn't stop it. So I signed the papers silently, giving my son and his wife exactly what they wanted. But something inside me cracked that day, a crack that will never heal. They looked at me like a stranger in my own home. I stayed quiet, but silence doesn't mean I wasn't hurting. It just meant I chose to swallow my tears instead. People like to say a house is nothing more than four walls and a roof. But to me, this house was my whole life. And yet there came a day when it was put up for sale like just another piece of property. The for sale sign went up right in the front yard, the very same yard where I planted those rose bushes when I was young. The March wind in the Midwest was sharp that day, swirling dead leaves around the sign, making it creak and groan. I stood at the window watching, and it felt like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart. The realtor, a neatly dressed man with a clipboard, paced back and forth with my son and daughter-in-law pointing at the lawn, the porch, the rooms, as if there were no memories here at all. I stood still, silent like a shadow in my own home. For weeks, people came and went touring the house. Young couples, older couples, everyone admiring how nice the place was, how great the location was. They saw it through the lens of numbers, what it was worth, what they could get out of it. None of them knew how many birthdays these walls had seen, how many Christmas mornings, how many nights we decorated the tree-baked cookies and opened gifts by the fireplace. Every time I heard them laugh about prices, it burned inside me. I wanted to scream, "This is my home. It's not something you can just bargain over, like a piece of furniture." But I stayed quiet, because in that room my voice no longer carried any weight. Eventually, a young couple from out of state fell in love with it at first sight. A few weeks later, the sale was final. My son was almost cheerful signing the papers, and my daughter-in-law was already planning how to transfer the funds. I'll never forget that day. Summer had just begun, and the sunlight streamed through the windows, bouncing off the piles of cardboard boxes stacked all around. I packed each photo frame, each family album with trembling hands. There weren't many things left, but every single item carried a memory. My fingers shook when they touched the photo from our wedding day. We were smiling, so big eyes sparkling like two kids. My son walked past, glanced at the frame in my hands, and said flatly, "Mom, keep that separate. Don't mix it in. The moving truck will be here soon." I nodded. I couldn't find the words. In just a few hours, our house, once so full of life, was empty. The walls were bare, echoing with footsteps, cold and hollow. I stood at the door looking at the living room one last time. When they pulled down the curtains I had sewn myself 15 years ago, I turned my face away. I didn't want them to see me cry. The moving truck pulled away. I sat in the back seat holding a small box tight against my chest. Inside were a few photos and my husband's old notebook. Through the window, I watched the house grow smaller and smaller, the white siding, the low wooden fence, the roses, until it disappeared around the curve of the street. It felt like part of me had been torn away with it. They moved me into a small rental on the edge of town. Clean, practical, but cold. No rustling leaves in the afternoon. No familiar neighbors laughing across the fence. I sat alone, staring at 4 unfamiliar walls, feeling like I had been uprooted from my own life. On the day we handed the keys over, my son and daughter-in-law were smiling, talking about their new plans. I walked behind them in silence, feeling like a guest. After signing the last document, they turned to me and said, "Don't worry, Mom. We'll take care of you now. You just relax." I nodded, but inside those words felt less like comfort and more like goodbye. For many nights I couldn't sleep. Lying awake, staring at the ceiling, I kept seeing the old house in my mind, the kitchen, the steps on the porch, the little corner of the yard where my husband and I used to sit with our tea in the evenings. It played in my head like an old home movie. And then it hit me I hadn't just lost a house. I'd lost the life my husband and I spent decades building. I tried not to blame them. I told myself maybe my son thought this was for the best, but the part that hurt the most he never asked. Not once did he sit down and ask me how I felt. In a country that values freedom and ownership so much, I suddenly realized that in the one place I called home, I no longer had a voice. I started to shrink into myself. Every morning, I still made my coffee, still walked around this strange new neighborhood, but nothing mattered. This apartment was just a place to sleep. It wasn't home. Sometimes I'd find myself driving past the old street. The house was different now. The new owners had painted the fence, cut down the rose bushes. They'd put out new chairs on the porch. I stayed far away, too afraid that if I took one step closer, I'd break down in front of strangers. The worst was the day I heard my daughter-in-law laughing on the phone. Good thing we sold that house for the right price. Leaving Mom there would have been pointless. Her words cut through me like glass. I turned away and walked back to my car. Every step felt like walking on shards. I realized then that I no longer belonged in their lives. That night I opened my husband's old notebook. Inside were the little notes he'd written over the years. Don't let yourself be lonely. Hold on to what matters most. This house is where you belong. I touched the last line and tears blurred the ink on the page. And I whispered, I don't know how, but I promise you I will find a way to hold on to something of ours. That night, in the middle of all that bitterness, a small seed of resolve began to grow in my heart, a silent promise that no one else would hear. I thought I had lost everything, my husband, my son, and now even my home. But in that moment when it felt like there was nothing left to hold on to, I began to watch quietly and from the shadows. A kind of watching they would never even notice. Life after leaving that old house felt like a blank page smeared with dull gray pencil strokes. I lived quietly in a rented apartment on the edge of town, where the only sounds were the wind and the distant hum of traffic, nothing familiar, nothing warm. In the beginning, I felt like someone abandoned in the middle of a vast city. Every morning, I still kept the same old habit: brew a cup of coffee, set it on the windowsill, and watch the light pour in. But now, instead of a yard full of red roses, there was only a cold, empty parking lot. I tried to find things to keep me busy. Sometimes I volunteered in the church kitchen, helping prepare meals for the homeless. Other times I spent afternoons at the public library, sorting books, the same library where I once worked part-time years ago. There, people would greet me with a simple good morning, and for a moment it felt nice. But every time I came back to that silent apartment, the weight of loneliness came rushing back, washing away those brief smiles. One afternoon I received a letter from the lawyer's office. At first I didn't pay much attention, probably just paperwork about the estate, I thought. But when I opened it, inside was a smaller envelope sealed carefully with handwriting I knew by heart, for you only. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter and a set of documents. Line by line, his familiar writing blurred as tears filled my eyes. I know that when I'm gone, things will be hard for you. I don't want anyone else deciding how you live the rest of your life. So, for years now, I've been quietly putting aside an investment in your name. One day when you need it, it will be there. No one knows about this, not even our son. I just want you to be free. I clutched that letter as if he were holding my hand again. I went to the bank and the investment office he mentioned. And just as he said there was an account money he'd set aside long ago, now grown into something large enough for me to stand on my own without depending on anyone. That day when I stepped out of the bank, I stood on the sidewalk and took the deepest breath I had taken in years. It wasn't about the money. It was the first time since he passed that I felt protected again. For the first time, I didn't feel completely alone. I told no one, not even my son. I chose silence. Instead of spending it, I left the money where it was and started learning. I attended free community workshops, read every book I could find on finance, and followed the housing market. No one paid attention to me, just a middle-aged woman with silver hair sitting quietly in the corner with a notebook. Bit by bit, I started to rebuild myself. Meanwhile, I heard whispers around town about my son and his wife. The business they invested in after selling the house hadn't gone as planned. At first, they bought a bigger house, new cars, vacations in Florida. But a few years later, things turned bad, losses piled up, friends drifted away, and finally I heard they'd even mortgaged their new home just to keep afloat. I didn't celebrate when I heard those things. If I'm honest, a mother's heart still aches when her child suffers. But at the same time, there was a strange calm in me. Life has its own way of setting things right. I kept my habit of driving down our old street once a month, just to see the house from afar. The young couple who had bought it didn't stay long. And one crisp October afternoon, as red maple leaves swirled on the pavement, I saw it again, a for sale sign planted right there in the yard. I froze. My heart pounded. The house, the place where every memory of my life with him lives, was up for sale again. I went home and pulled out his old letter, reading it over and over. Those words whispered to me, I want you to be free. I want you to hold on to what matters most. That night, for the first time in years, I lit a small candle and set it in front of his photo. The soft glow danced across his gentle smile. I whispered, my love. You already know, don't you? I'm going to take it back. Not to show off. Not for revenge. But because this is where I belong. From that night on, I started preparing. Quietly, I contacted a realtor, gathered information about the upcoming auction. Everything I did in silence. I told no one, not my son, not a neighbor. No blaming, no crying, just focus. I chose to watch. I watched from a distance, seeing them drive around in an old car, now faces tired, confidence gone. I watched the old neighbors, the ones who still ask about me from time to time. I watched the house every day, every week, as if I was afraid it would vanish if I looked away. Some afternoons I stood in the shadow across the street, watching the sunset hit those familiar windows. I remembered every scratch on the stair rail, every tile in the kitchen that we had chosen together. Everything was still there, just waiting for me to come back. Time passed, and the day of the auction drew closer. I prepared everything, bank papers, plans, my heart ready. No one could guess that behind the quiet face of a widow, I was ready for one moment that would change everything, to take back what I had lost. And in that silence, a strength began to rise inside me, the kind of strength you only find after you've lost everything, but refuse to give up. I know that soon I'll come back, not to fight or take anything from anyone, but to reclaim the piece of my soul that was taken away. And on that day, I will no longer be the quiet mother standing in the corner. The morning of the auction was crisp and cold. Autumn in the Midwest always has that sting in the wind, and the maple leaves covered the street in gold. I pulled on an old sweater and stepped out of the car in front of the building where the auction would be held. It was an old red brick building that had been there for decades, with a sign out front, public auction, real estate. The heavy wooden doors opened to the faint smell of old timber mixed with hot coffee. Inside, people gathered in small groups, whispering, waiting, nervous. I chose a seat all the way in the back. My registration and financial documents had been ready for weeks. No one paid attention to the gray-haired woman in a plain sweater. I glanced around and saw a few familiar faces, old neighbors, local realtors, and then I saw them, my son and his wife. They looked so different from a few years ago, lines of stress on their faces, clothes no longer polished. They sat near the front talking to a man in a suit, probably a bank representative. I knew in that moment they were here for the same reason. They wanted the house back. My heart was pounding, but I kept perfectly still. The auctioneer stood up, his voice firm and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, today we'll begin the auction for 184 Maple Street, one of the most anticipated properties on the list. That address. Just hearing it sent a current through my body. The bidding started. The first numbers came in low, then climbed higher. Every time a paddle went up, my heart stopped for a beat. I waited. I knew exactly when to move. My son and his wife were bidding too, their paddles going up again and again, tension carved into their faces. From the back, I watched him once, a little boy running through that same yard, now a grown man trying to reclaim the place he was born. As the numbers rose, people began to drop out one by one until only a few of us were left, them and me. The auctioneer called out, $350,000, do I hear higher? I raised my paddle for the first time. A few people turned to look. My son glanced back, startled when he saw me there. But he said nothing, just turned away. The bidding went on. The numbers climbed fast. Each time my son raised his paddle, I raised mine higher. At first they didn't notice, but eventually my daughter-in-law started whispering to him, her eyes darting toward me. 500,000 who'll give me more. I stood up, my voice steady. 600,000. The room fell silent. Every head turned. My son froze, stunned. He never expected that the frail, quiet woman in the back could throw out a number like that. The auctioneer repeated, $600,000. Anyone higher? My son lifted his paddle again, his hand trembling. 620. I took a step forward, my eyes fixed on the room. 700,000. A murmur rippled through the hall. The auctioneer tapped the gavel, reading the number aloud. My son stared at me, eyes bloodshot. My daughter-in-law turned away, her jaw clenched. 700,000, do I hear more? Silence. No one else moved. My son lowered his paddle, defeated. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold. The room went silent. The winning bid goes to... Mrs. I walked to the front. People made way. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. I picked up the pen and signed. My hand didn't shake. For the first time in years, I stood tall. When it was done, I turned to face my son and his wife. My voice was calm, but every word was clear. This house was once the home your father and I built. You sold it away. Today, I bought it back with the money your father left for me. Money you never even knew existed. The room went so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The man from the bank lowered his head. A few old neighbors looked at each other, whispering in shock. I went on. Your father trusted me. He set aside a part of his estate that no one could touch. I never told you because I didn't want to fight with you. But today I'm here to take back what belongs to this family. My son opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes were full of shame and anger. My daughter-in-law looked down, biting her lip. I took a deep breath and said softly but firmly, You thought that selling this house would be the end, but there are some things that run too deep to be taken away. This is my home, and from this day forward it will be mine again. And with that, I turned and walked away. The sunlight poured through the glass doors, bright and warm. For the first time in years, I walked out without bowing my head. On the way back, I drove down the old street. Leaves swirled in the wind, my hair whipping across my face. I stopped in front of that familiar wooden fence and reached out to touch it. The house still stood there, waiting quietly, patiently for me to come home. That day, I didn't need to shout. I didn't need anyone to apologize. I simply took back what was mine all along. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I felt free. The day I received the keys, winter had already set in. A cold wind rushed through the bare trees, sharp against my skin. I stood at the front gate, the new keys trembling in my hand, not from the cold, but from everything I was feeling. The sold sign was gone. The White House, with its low wooden fence and worn front steps, seemed to have been waiting for me all this time. I climbed the steps slowly, as if each one took me backward through the years, back to a life I thought I had lost. When I opened the door, a mix of fresh paint and old wood filled the air. The house had been renovated, some things were gone, but the heart of it, the bones of this place, was still the same. I walked from room to room, fingertips brushing the walls, each corner as familiar as a memory. In the living room I stopped. Soft light filtered through the window, catching the dust floating in the air. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I swore I could hear his laugh again. I began moving in. There was no party, no celebration, just me. A few older neighbors came by, shook my hand, hugged me gently, and whispered, "Welcome home." Those 2 words made my eyes sting. In those first days, I didn't rush to unpack. I just wanted to walk through the house, to breathe it in. In the backyard, the bench still had our names carved into the wood. The maple tree out front had grown taller, its bare branches stretching toward the sky. I trimmed the rose bushes out front, each careful snip, feeling like stitching up an old wound. Some afternoons I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, staring out at the quiet street. The winter wind was cold, but for the first time in years my heart felt warm. I wasn't afraid anymore. Because now I knew I had done what he always wanted, I had kept this home. But joy is never whole. A slow, dull sadness lingers. At night, when the house gets too quiet, I open the closet and stare at the empty space where his coat used to hang. At the table, the chair beside me will always stay empty. I got the house back, but I didn't get my family back. My son doesn't call. He doesn't visit. My daughter-in-law stays silent as if nothing ever happened. Whatever bound us together was broken long ago, and it won't be easy to fix. I don't hold anger anymore. I just feel a deep sadness for a world where money can pull people so far apart. One weekend afternoon, I opened every window, letting the wind and sunlight pour in. I laid down an old rug, hung up a few old paintings, and in the corner I placed a small piano, the one he gave me on our 20th anniversary. The sound of those hesitant notes filled the house, soft and uneven, but it made the emptiness less heavy. Every now and then, a neighbor stops by. We talk about old times. They ask how I'm doing. I smile and say I'm fine. I just want to hold on to the memories. Simple words, but they understand. Every morning I make a cup of coffee and sit on the porch right where he and I used to sit together. The sunlight warms my face. I close my eyes, take a deep breath, and feel my heart finally loosen. There is no hatred left in me. On the day of the auction, I thought I'd feel triumphant winning the house back. But when I held the keys in my hand, all I felt was a quiet, aching sadness. Because in the end, it was never about money or pride. I just wanted a home, a place to remember the man who walked with me through half a lifetime. One winter evening, I stood at the window watching the snow drift down white against the dark street. I poured a glass of red wine and opened our old photo album. On the very first page was our wedding photo. Simple clothes, simple smiles, 2 young faces glowing with joy. I placed my hand on the picture and whispered, "Do you see, my love? I made it back." It took a long, long road, but in the end I came home. A tear slid down my cheek, but this time it didn't hurt. This tear was to close a chapter. I know from now on I will walk through life alone, but here in this house I am no longer lost. Here all the beautiful memories have finally come back home.